All eyes on Brazil as Rio is hours away from opening the 2016 Olympic Games. The host country faces challenges but promises a Games to remember. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Despite a political crisis and economic downturn, Zika fears and social unrest, Rio says it's ready to host the 2016 Summer Olympic Games. This year's events mark the first time South America has hosted the Games. For a look at how Rio is handling the challenges amid the celebration, CCTV's Stephen Gibbs joins us now from Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro. And Stephen, Brazil is currently facing what some are calling a perfect storm of crises, from political to economic, social to health. How is the situation they're playing into the Olympics?
Yes, well, you could say it's like a perfectly badly timed storm. If you look back to 2009 when Rio was awarded the Olympics, it was so much the obvious choice, Brazil, really, this sort of booming economy while the rest of the world was reeling from the financial crisis of 2008. Since then, right, in this year and this last couple of years, rather the reverse is true, with this big, steep recession going on here, the worst since the 1930s, a bad political crisis with the president having to stand down facing impeachment, and as you say, to cap it all, the Zika virus seeming to affect Brazil much more than any other country in the world. Now, how is that affecting the Olympics? Well, clearly, it's a bit of a downer. If you ask Brazilians, around 60% of them say that on balance they think the Olympics will be a negative event, which is pretty incredible when you consider what a big sporting nation this is. But let's not overstate it. As you mentioned, this is the first Olympics ever to be held in South America, and I think that on balance that's going to look like a bit of an oversight historically. Incredible, really, that never before has an Olympics been held in this region of the world, with all these massive sporting nations here with a big young population. So let's see how this all pans out in the next couple of weeks.
A big sporting nation, as you point out, Stephen. Brazil hosted the World Cup in 2014, and we heard all those doomsday predictions about that. But in the end, it was a very successful World Cup. Can they replicate that success for the Olympics?
I think you've made exactly the point there. I think before we get too negative about the Olympics, let's just sort of wind the tape back and listen to what everyone was saying about the World Cup just before it took place, that there was no way that the tourists and the fans would be able to get to the stadium all over the country, that it would be an organisational disaster. Of course, it was very far from that, and everyone really now says the event itself was a huge success in both sort of spectator terms and in terms of the football, of course, not entirely for the host Brazil. But the parallel is interesting. If you look at the World Cup in terms of its legacy, well, it is problematic. That cost $15 billion. A whole lot of stadia were built all over Brazil. Look now, a lot of them are not really being used for what they were designed for. And the fear of the Olympics, and really this is part of the skepticism you're hearing from Brazilians at the moment, is whether this really would have been worth it. $10 billion at a time of recession for this country. You know, will that actually seem to have been money well spent at the end of the day?
And to the Games itself, Stephen, what are the highlights we can expect? We already know that this will be the first time there will be a refugee team at the Games.
Yes, good. Let's talk about the sport, because, of course, ultimately that should be what this is all about. And I think the great sort of counter-argument to the negativity about these games will be particularly that refugee team. There are 10 athletes there. Many of them speak different languages, and they really embody the opposite of what's the sort of worst side of the Olympics, as people say, the sort of the money side of it, the corporate side. These are people who represent the original spirit, and for the first time ever, you know, a team that doesn't represent a specific nation. There are also other young individual sportsmen that will be certainly making their first appearance at these Olympics, and some names to watch, just to go through a quick three. There's from Jamaica, Jahil Hyde, a footballer who's now a hurdler and is considered one of the best in the world. Very high hopes for him. He's just 18. Here from Brazil, there's Matheus Santana. He's a swimmer. He's just 20, and there is a lot of expectation he's going to be a sort of celebrity star performer here in Brazil, especially if he helps this country win the 4 times 100 meters freestyle. There are a lot of hopes that Brazil will achieve that. And finally, another young athlete to pay attention to is Xia Ji from China, the diver. She began diving when she was just 6 and will be certainly a major contender here in her first Olympic Games here in Rio. So yes, we've got 24 hours to go before this whole thing starts, and I suspect what we'll be talking about in next week will be much less some of this news about the whole infrastructure of the Games and a lot more about the sport.
Thanks, Stephen. That's CCTV's Stephen Gibbs talking to us from Rio de Janeiro. Well, let's get to our panel right now. Joining us from Sao Paulo, Leo Siqueira is the Director of Latin America for the AIM Group and a writer and political analyst. With me in the studio, Rafael Salis is the Director of Brazilian Operations for Southern Pulse, a strategic advisory firm. And from New York, Alex Quadros is author of Brazilianaires, Wealth, Power and Decadence and Hope in an American Country. And via Skype from Brazil, Fabio Osterman is a political scientist and professor. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Leo, let me start with you. You know, we hear all these challenges that Brazil faces right now, economic challenges, political, health, social, security challenges. Do you believe the country is ready for the Olympics?
I think that's a great opportunity for Brazil to learn from its own mistakes. I think that there are a lot of concerns about security in Brazil, especially given the fact that ISIS has made some threats to Brazil. So far, to what I've been seeing, I've actually been at the Arena Corinthians yesterday to watch Canada and Australia, and to what I could perceive, I see that Brazil is somewhat prepared in terms of security, but of course, when it comes to major problems that could happen, I think that we still have a bunch of problems and issues that we have to deal with. I'm not sure that our national security is able to respond in a quickly way if there's a terrorist attack, for example. But you know, Brazil is a very friendly country. I hope we don't have to count on luck in order to be safe. I think that's a great opportunity for Brazil to learn about itself and rethink about its capabilities to host big events. As our previous guest has commented, I think the more we advance into the Games itself, we'll talk much more less about the problems, and we'll focus much more on the Games itself. But of course, there are some security problems and concerns that everyone has.
Right until these final days before the Games start, big question marks in Brazil over the Olympics. Could the country afford it? There were security concerns, there were concerns over the Zika virus, social concerns. Do you believe that the country has successfully managed to overcome these challenges and will stage a great Olympic Games?
Unfortunately, I'm much less optimistic about the future of these Olympic Games, and specifically of this point of view that puts the government in the center of the organization of such huge and spendful events. I don't think, unfortunately, that Brazil is ready for this event, but I think Brazilian people is starting to get ready to understand that we shouldn't give that much power to politicians. With World Cup and the Olympic Games, we have spent more than 100 billion reais in government money, which means money taken out of our pockets, out of the pockets of Brazilian taxpayers. I am a bit fearful also about the conditions of public safety in the city of Rio, but not only in the city of Rio, because lots of policemen and military men have been dislocated from their cities of origin all across the country to Rio. Right. So even Rio might be in a good situation in terms of public safety, but the other places in Brazil might not be that lucky during this period.
Okay, Rafael, that is not a pretty picture that Fabio is painting over there, saying that Brazil is really not ready for this, can't afford it. What do you think?
I more to Leo's first point regarding terrorism specifically. While a first response to a terrorist attack might be slower than you'd want in that type of situation, I do think authorities are pretty well prepared to stop a terrorist attack before it occurs. Part of that rests on the criminal underground and its specific dynamics in Rio de Janeiro state, city, and the country in Brazil. Part of it is a lot about the operational capacity of specific terrorist groups, even lone wolves in Brazil, and how they could attempt to perpetrate an attack. And part of it is just an overflow of security throughout the city of Rio. The second point is, and this is a concern that I have and that we saw in the World Cup as well, is that a problem we do have is the capacity of joint operations within Brazilian law enforcement and Brazilian military. We know that Brazilian military and the Brazilian Federal Police do not interact very well, and one always tries to exert its authority over security in the games above the other. Regarding preparations for the games, I do think that the initial piece was spot on in regards to organization, where a lot of the concerns that we're seeing right now were very similar concerns that we saw during the World Cup. I think Rio as a city itself has perpetrated and put on major events for most of its lifetime. Let's look at Carnival, for example. Over 2 million, 4 million people go to the city streets every year during Carnival. In Copacabana Beach alone, during New Year's, you have over 2 million people. And it's a relatively peaceful and successful events every year. So I'm more optimistic on the events. Regarding the legacy and the expenses during these events, the World Cup was definitely a step backwards regarding 12 host cities instead of 8. The amount of public money that was used to subsidize construction, not necessarily construct, but to subsidize construction. And similar things happened in Rio, where a lot of the construction was subsidized by public money, federal money specifically, and from the BNDES, which is the Brazilian Social Development Economic Bank. But not that much money was directly put in through the state or the city that wasn't actually specific for infrastructure. So let's say the metro, new BRT systems, and things of that sort. But in the end, you do have a state that it has overreached in the past 3 to 4 years through a number of problems, specifically due to a mixture of tax deductions to companies and overreaching pension systems that have gutted the state.
And ultimately, Brazil, we've already seen it as a country that puts on a great show.
Yes.
We've seen that so often. Let's go to Alex in New York. Alex, what do you make of the point that Fabio was making about the cost of these games? Can Brazil afford this at this time?
I think that he raises a very good point. When Brazil won the right to hold these games back in 2009, the feeling was very different. As your correspondent pointed out, the economy was booming, and there was this incredible optimism about the country's future and a feeling that, it could do anything. And the reality turned out to be quite different. Rather than showing off its progress toward developed nation status, Brazil's revealing itself still to have a lot of problems. It's not a rich country. It's not a poor country, but it's a country with a lot of poor people in it. And I think the urgent question is, when you talk about spending hundreds of millions of dollars just on sporting facilities for an event like this, was that the best use of that money? And the other fact of the Olympic spending is that, I think there was a vision of how the Olympics could transform Rio into a more modern city and a more inclusive city. But in the end, a disproportionate amount of the budget was poured into a wealthy suburb called Barra da Tijuca, where 300,000 mostly well-to-do people live. This is a city of 12 million people. 1 in 7 live in favelas, and they have desperate infrastructure needs. The single most expensive Olympic project is a nearly $3 billion subway line that connects Baja, this wealthy suburb, to Ipanema, which is a fancy, lovely beachside neighborhood. Meanwhile, there's a cheaper subway extension that's been on the drawing board for a long time in the working class north side of the city that didn't get built. So I think it's very legitimate and even urgent to analyze how the money was spent and to think about how that money could be spent better.
Leo, what do you make of these concerns that you've been hearing? Did Brazil have to perform something of a balancing act here? On the one hand, the Olympic Games, or the World Cup for that matter, affords any country in the world a huge opportunity to market itself to the world. It's a great PR exercise. So did Brazil have to balance that against the fact that, well, it may not have had the money to produce these games, or the money could have been spent elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Brazil, before launching the games, making the opening ceremony, I've read actually, that Brazil will be much more, will make a much more humble opening ceremony, which is in line with its political and economic situation right now. I think that some of the points that we've been discussing here are very important, such as the investments in infrastructure to the poor neighborhoods, to the favelas, to the slums. I think Brazil still has a way to go in terms of infrastructure. We've been talking much about the legacy of the Olympics. We're yet to understand and to see the benefits of the World Cup. But I've seen some studies, some researchers that point, one of them from FGV says that the income of residents of Rio have risen 30.3% from 2009 to 2016, just before the games were announced, and that the games were announced in Rio. So we're starting to see some little changes. I'm not sure if those changes are enough to justify the amount of money that is being spent in this event, given the urgent needs that Rio City has in other less privileged areas. But I do think it's more an opportunity to Brazil to think itself. Suspended President Dilma Rousseff, the Olympics was its baby, and now she's not taking much care of it because she can't.
Right.
And interim President Michel Temer has a challenge in his hands. So it sounds like it's a problem that nobody wants to take care of, and we need to figure it out, because on this depends much of the future of Rio.
Fabio, we've been hearing about a lot of the concerns concerning these games. You've raised those concerns yourself, but are we perhaps being a little bit too fixated on the problems and the challenges that Brazil faces, rather than looking at the positive side of things and looking at something like these games, which does afford a country a huge opportunity to show itself off to the world?
Honestly, I think the main benefits will be felt specifically and perhaps only by the people who will be providing services to the specific time, during the specific time of the Olympics. Remembering that this amount of money that was spent with the World Cup and with the Olympic Games are the equivalent to the whole budget for health in this whole country for a year. And as Leo pointed out, we're a country with urgent needs that should be addressed first. before thinking about hosting such a huge event with public money. I'm not against the Olympics. I'm only against Olympics being hosted with public money. There was a mention about the infrastructure projects that were made possible by the Olympics. But my question is, do we really need Olympic Games to understand that some infrastructure projects are needed? Or were they built specifically to serve the Olympics, and after that they will be left behind, as it happened with several of the stadiums that were built across the country for the World Cup? I think this will serve as a cautionary tale for other countries. I think actually this is already serving as a cautionary tale, as Greece has served for us. Greece was a country, better off with its financial situation, and after the Olympics, it began a whole period of financial bankruptcy. And Brazil is already on the verge of bankruptcy right now, and after the Olympics are gone, I fear that the situation will even get worse.
What do you think, Rafael?
I think, for example, the points that Alex brought up are very important, specifically on the question of choices where you're going to invest and how you're going to invest this in Rio specifically. But in the end, and as a Rio citizen and someone that was brought up in the city, when I look at the new options of public transportation beyond the metro system to Barra, which is the largest growing part of Rio right now, along with Santa Cruz and Campo Grande. The BRT system is something Rio de Janeiro citizens had never had. Now, is that a suboptimal solution? Of course it is. It would much be preferable to have had a light rail system doing mass transportation throughout the west zone of Rio, integrated to models that go into mass bus lines that give capillarity to a public transport system, much like the old car system that Rio had before the 1950s. Unfortunately, that choice was not made, and a suboptimal choice was made, but will people be better past the Olympics because of that suboptimal choice? Yes, they will. Would it have been better to expand the second line of the metro into Praça 15 to link up with the boat system that takes you to Niterói, and then expand the fourth line of the metro into Niterói past the Guanabara Bay? Yes, it probably would have had been better as well, but that would still leave out the fact it's likely one of the fastest growing areas of the city, and most Rio de Janeiro citizens work in downtown Rio. So they still have to go through 2 to 3 hour commutes.
Right. The mayor of Rio has been very upbeat about these games. Well, he's going to be upbeat. He's the mayor of Rio. And he says there are parts of the city, and he referred to the old part, the port of the city, which has been neglected. And it's getting attention now because the games are coming to Rio.
Yeah, well, the port area of Rio de Janeiro, most like specifically the Gamboa area and Praça Mauá areas, are traditional areas of Rio and where Rio began as a city in a sense. That's why you'd find the world's largest slave importation port is in that area, the port of Valonguinho, and they found it during construction for the Verité and reurbanization of the area, because that's where Rio City started. And yes, it was neglected for the better part of 40 years. However, the type of renovation that was envisioned for this area is much like a Barcelona-type renovation, a downbeat part of the city, and you're middle-classing it. In a sense, you're bringing in businesses, you're bringing in your more avant-garde part of society to this area in order to increase real estate prices. And that itself has a neglect that has been touched upon here in a sense, where a lot of the lower-class citizens of Rio have suffered from that, either through rising rents or having to move forcefully so that renovations could be done.
Right. Leo, I just have a little bit of time left, but I want to ask you about the games itself. I mean, is Rio expecting a large influx of visitors, and is the country and the city itself ready for this influx of not just the visitors? Of course, there's thousands of athletes who will be there as well.
Yeah, in fact, 80% of the tickets for the Olympics were already sold. I think Brazil is somewhat divided, and the pessimists and the optimists, and it relates to the political situation that we have. And remember, the coming of the Olympics to Rio was mostly a political decision. And at the time, we decided that we wanted to have the Olympic Games hosted in Brazil and in Rio. We had a much different situation, economically speaking and politically speaking. And now we have this challenging situation. But I do think that there's time for Brazilians to get a bit more optimistic. You know, the same thing, a similar thing happened in the World Cup. Everyone, or a lot of people, were just pessimistic about the works
Right.
at the major stadiums. But when the games began, everyone was cheering for their team. So my concern is that we as Brazilians may forget the challenges that we have and just look at the games.
And enjoy the games. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but our Olympics coverage is just beginning, of course. For the latest from Rio, check our website at cctv-america.com/Olympics. As we leave you, China has 416 athletes at the Rio Olympics. That's the largest delegation they've sent to a foreign games. They'll be competing in 210 events across 26 sports. CCTV spoke to some of the athletes getting ready to step into the spotlight.
Seeing the 5 rings makes me nervous. Pressures and a sense of responsibility keeps growing. As a result, I may lose my appetite and cannot sleep well sometimes.
Surprising to me that I can participate in another Olympics. I retired after competing at the 2008 Games because I had to. I got married and gave birth to a baby. After 2012, I think I had fully accepted the idea of retirement. This year, I will compete in 2 different shooting events.
I feel all right. I'm not that excited. I want to treat it like a regular competition, like I do in the World Cup and World Championships. I don't feel nervous now, but I might be the night before the event.
We should be mentally prepared first, because the Olympics is the highest level of competition in the world. We'll fight hard in every minute, for every ball and during every game.
I have thought over all the difficulties. Only if you face up to difficulties can you challenge them. I don't think it's necessary to think about the result. What I need to do is to pay attention to the course of events. If my partner and I can perform our dives well, I think we will get close to the gold medal.